still, my talk is on a Chonangpa, on a disciple on. Can't be helped, Well, on a disciple of Dolpopa Sherab Gyaltsen, Shangten Senam Drakpas, and he had written two commentaries with extensive introductions. One commentary is on the Tathagatagarbha Sutra, and another one on the Ratnakotra Vibhaga. And in both instructions, he gives a detailed analysis of Buddha nature theory. And in these introductions, he defends his guru's clear-cut distinction between Buddha nature and the ground consciousness. As you all know, Dolpopa equated Buddha nature with an ultimate that is unconditioned and that is fully identical with Buddhahood, and distinguished that from anything dependently arisen, or also from the ground consciousness. So, and he shows, first of all, he admits that there are canonical passages which equate Buddha nature with the ground consciousness. You find such passages in the Lankavatara Sutra and the Gandavyuha Sutra. But he argues that you have 8 undesired consequences if you maintain this equation, or if you take this equation as a teaching with a definitive meaning. Now here are the undesired consequences. So Shangten introduces his introduction, or his discussion of the relation between Buddha nature and the ground consciousness by pointing out these undesired consequences. So if Buddha nature and the ground consciousness were the same, the unconditioned would be the same as the conditioned, the non-conceptual would be the same as the conceptual, the dependent nature would be the same as the perfect nature, and that which must be abandoned and attained would be the same. The neutral and the virtuous would be the same. The ultimate and the relative would be the same. Luminosity and obscuration would be the same. And then the 8th is just, there are a lot of undesired consequences because of many other grave mistakes. It's this ominous Tibetan la sokpa, so there are just many more. So now I just give a brief overview of a few canonical texts which are relevant to the discussion here of these 8 undesired consequences. First of all, the Lankavatara Sutra has passages which equates ground consciousness with Buddha nature, but then again, in the same sutra, Buddha nature is also equated with emptiness and signlessness and wishlessness and so on. So, in other words, and that's also the argument of Shangten, the Lankavatara Sutra has different passages which are not fully congruent. And then another important text which matters in this discussion is the Mahayana Sangraha. And here we find a clear-cut distinction between a pure Dhammadhatu, which is different from the ground consciousness. Shangten or also others see in the pure Dhammadhatu a synonym of Buddha nature. So you can discuss the Mahayana Sangraha in this context if you accept the equation of pure Dhammadhatu with Buddha nature. It goes without saying that the term Buddha nature is itself not mentioned in the Mahayana Sangraha. And this distinction between the pure Dhammadhatu and the ground consciousness is so clear-cut that it is said that when sentient beings study and reflect and practice the Dharma, the seeds of these deeds are not put into the ground consciousness, but into the pure Dhammadhatu which pervades all sentient beings. So the ground consciousness is just something impure and something to be abandoned, and the remedy cultivated to abandon the ground consciousness cannot be stored, or the seeds of this remedy cannot be stored in what has to be abandoned. So we have a clear-cut distinction here in the Mahayana Sangraha. Then we have the Tathagatagarbha sutras, and I always make the distinction between the Tathagatagarbha sutra, which was edited and translated and discussed by Michael Zimmermann, a great work which I always take as a reference work, also following your interpretation of it. And then like you have a group of sutras which teach Tathagatagarbha, and in them, and like you basically have an equation of Buddha nature with the Dharmakaya, or in other words, there is no distinction between Buddhahood and Buddha nature. And this Buddha nature is separate or different from the adventitious stains which cover it. And I just summarize Michael Zimmermann's conclusion. The general idea of the 9 examples of the Tathagatagarbha Sutra convey that all sentient beings already possess in themselves a full-fledged Tathagata. One could argue, however, as Gyaltsaba Shenupel does and many others, that the examples of a tree grown from a seed and the future monarch in the womb indicate a growth of the Buddha qualities. Zhang does not follow this line of thought and explains that there is no movement or literally development in Buddha nature whatsoever when it is becoming free from its adventitious stains. Now, following the Anunatva, Apunatva, Nyadesha to the latter, Zhang fully endorses the equation of the Buddha nature with the Dharmakaya, and thus, according to the Ratnagotra Vibhaga 184, the ultimate nirvana. Then we have the standard Indian treatise on Buddha nature, the Ratnagotra Vibhaga, and it, like in many parts, endorses the equation of Buddha nature and the Dharmakaya, which you find in most Tathagatagarbha sutras. But it has also passages which indicate to a natural growth. The third reason for the presence of Buddha nature in sentient beings is that the fruit or the Dharmakaya has been only metaphorically applied to the Buddha potential. So Buddha nature is only metaphorically called after its fruit. In reality, it's just the potential to become a Buddha. And Gyaltsaba, in all his commentary, always refers again and again to this one reason. Whenever there is a full equation of Buddha nature with the Dharmakaya, he says, well, this needs to be further explained. It's only identical with regard to a certain aspect, with regard to its emptiness or with regard to its suchness. But there is also a difference because we have this third reason. So he repeatedly goes back to this. Now, again, we have a situation which is ambivalent. We have, on the one hand, the full equation of the Buddha nature with the Dharmakaya. But on the other hand, we also have strategies which try to establish a difference between Buddha nature and the Dharmakaya, which then means, that it can't be really unconditioned or ultimate and permanent, because you need then a kind of natural growth, or a blossoming of qualities. Now, another thing we have to talk about is the three nature theory of the Yogacara. The Abhidharmikas distinguished the truly existent Dravya Sat factors of existence, dharma, from the merely nominal existence, Prajñapti Sat, of false projections, in order to retain an ontological distinction, even though in a modified way. The Yogacaras restricted then the emptiness of the Prajnaparamita Sutras, which they follow, to the imagined nature. The latter is taken to be a product of false imagining, abhuta parikalpa, which is the dependent nature of mind, which is accorded a higher degree of reality than the imagined nature. These two natures, together with a perfect nature, which is defined as the absence of the imagined from the dependent, constitute the Yogacara model of reality. Then we have to know that the perfect nature consists of two parts. It is first the unchanging perfect, namely the never-changing absence or non-existence of duality, and the perfect in terms of being unmistaken with regard to true reality, and that's normally the non-conceptual wisdom cultivated on the path. And there is the concept of fundamental transformation, and after fundamental transformation, the dependently arising mind stops being in the mode of false imagining, and one realizes true reality as it is. So you could say, like, the impure dependent turns into a pure dependent. There are other models of the three nature theory, for example in the Brihatika, where the perfect nature is said to be empty of the dependent and imagined, and not only the imagined as in more traditional Yogacara. Now what Zhang does in order to uphold his clear-cut distinction, he restricts the perfect nature to the unchangeable perfect nature and argues that the unmistaken perfect nature, which is the wisdom cultivated on the path, is not truly perfect. It does not belong to the perfect nature. It's only the unchangeable perfect, which is the ground of negation, and everything else is then negated. So for Zhang, the unchangeable perfect is empty of the imagined, the dependent, and the unmistaken perfect. So we have to keep this in mind, that there is a difference between the Chonang interpretation or Zhang's interpretation of Yogacara and what we have in the Yogacara text. Quite interesting is also a comparison of Zhang with Gyalotsawa's Chenupel's position. Well, as I just said, for Zhang, Buddha nature is the unchangeable perfect nature, and for Gyalotsawa, the Buddha nature is a natural luminosity in a beginningless continuity. And so for Zhang, Buddha nature does not belong to the dependent arising. For Gyalotsawa, it does. Yeah? And for Gyalotsawa also, he is quoting quite often the Lankavatara for the equation of alaya vijnana with Buddha nature, but basically explains that the alaya vijnana is a reflection of Buddha nature. They are like the ocean and the waves. Yeah. So when the wind steers up the ocean, the ocean has waves. And just as the waves are not really different from the ocean, when you analyze waves, you find water. So in a similar way, the alaya vijnana is not really different from Buddha nature. And whereas Zhang and also Delpopa, they would not accept that and exclude the Buddha nature from dependent arising. For them, the preferred example would be the gold nugget fallen into mud. When you analyze mud, you don't find gold. Yeah? But when you analyze waves, you find water. So just as the mud and the gold nugget are completely different, so for the Chonangpas, the Buddha nature and the alaya vijnana are completely different. Now these are, I have to watch the time a little bit. So these are the Lankavatara quotations which Zhang quotes, and he acknowledges that there are passages which equate the ground consciousness with Buddha nature. And now we come to the 8 undesired consequences. Probably I won't have the time to go through all of them in detail, but I try all the same. There is first of all, the undesired consequence that the conditioned would be the unconditioned, it would be the same if alaya vijnana and Buddha nature would be the same. And Zhang skillfully quotes here two texts by the same author, at least according to the Tibetan tradition, namely Asanga. And well, he first of all quotes the Ratnagotra Vibhaga Vyakhya, and in it the quotation of the Srimala Devi Sutra, which says or claims that the Buddha element or Buddha nature always remains unchanged. Yeah. So it says, the sutra says so, well, there are the fires of death, disease, old age, and so on, but in all, by all these fires, Buddha nature is not affected and remains the same. It is said in the Srimala Devi Sutra to be stable, eternal, and so on. In other words, it's unconditioned, whereas the ground consciousness is part of the continuous causal process that includes all defilements. Zhang quotes here the Mahayana Sangraha and an explanation how the alaya vijnana and the defilements are mutually dependent and mutually cause each other. In other words, the ground consciousness is conditioned. Yeah. Well, Shönupel would object that Buddha nature is not entirely unconditioned and only permanent in the sense that it is forever contained in its own sphere. Yeah. So so Shönupel says conditions means conditioned by external artificial causes and conditions, and says that Buddha nature does not depend on external condition, but still it's a continuous flow, and in a sense still goes through moments. Yeah. And once the adventitious stains are removed, your subtle Buddha qualities blossom into Buddhahood. And such a dynamic process is possible because Buddha nature continues in a beginningless series of moments of Buddha qualities. The point here is that Shönupel attributes to a positively described ultimate Buddha nature the two contradictory attributes of being unconditioned and momentary. To exempt Buddha nature or the luminosity from the rule that only something conditioned is momentary can be traced back to a source of late Indian Buddhism, which there is a clause in the Mahayanottara Tantra Shastra Upadesha which precisely states that, and I refer to the thesis by Kasu Kanno, who has translated the Upadesha together with the gloss. Yeah, so the next one. So the next undesired consequence would be that the non-conceptual would be the conceptual, and here Zhang refers to the Nirvikalpa Pravesha Dharani, and he argues that the non-conceptual sphere or dhatu, which is realized by not becoming mentally engaged by amanasikara, is equivalent to the Buddha nature. So that would be his argument for Buddha nature being non-conceptual, whereas the ground consciousness is explained as conceptual in the Mahayana Sangraha. Yeah, so he quotes Mahayana Sangraha 120. There are 10 types of conceptuality. The main one is the ground consciousness. Yeah. Then the next would be that the undesired consequence that the dependent and the perfect natures would be the same. Yeah. And well, he quotes here mostly the Mana Sutra Alankara, and he quotes a verse where false imagining or abhuta parikalpa is defined as the characteristic of the dependent nature. And then he quotes Mana Sutra Alankara 1951, that which says that the dependent nature is something to be abandoned, by fully understanding the three natures, you come to know the baseness of the dependent nature and the necessity to abandon it. And on the other hand, he understands dependent nature as something to be abandoned. And then, he quotes also the Mana Sutra Alankara 6.1, which is on reality and gives a definition of true reality. The sutra says, the Mana Sutra Alankara says, the ultimate, i.e. non-duality, is neither existent nor non-existent, and so on. And neither existence means in terms of the imagined and dependent marks, and nor non-existence in terms of the perfect marks. So he shows that dependent nature and the perfect nature cannot be the same. Yeah. So Zhang Tun's argument rests on the reduction of the ground consciousness to the impure dependent nature that must be abandoned, and Buddha nature to the unchangeable perfect nature. This analysis tacitly ignores, however, the unmistaken perfect nature or the non-conceptual wisdom of the path, which some masters like Dolpopa call pure dependent. Being beyond duality, it could be argued that it still partakes of suchness and thus Buddha nature. This, in fact, is the view of the third Karmapa Rangchung Dorje. In other words, even though Rangchung Dorje distinguishes the ground consciousness from a stainless mind, or Kunchi Namshi from a Kunchi and suchness, he still includes both categories within dependent arising. Buddha nature is then also not restricted to the unchangeable perfect, but also includes the unmistaken perfect, which Rangchung Dorje takes as the ultimate truth in relation to the principle of true nature and the inexpressible ultimate truth. Yeah. So, in other words, you could question this analysis of Zhang Tun by saying, well, the three nature theory is not such that the perfect and the dependent are completely separate from each other, but there is a common ground of the dependent and the perfect nature, namely the pure dependent, if you want, or that which is cultivated on the path. Now, that what must be abandoned would be the same as what must be attained. And here, Zhang Tun quotes again the Ratnakotra Vibhaka, which says that Buddhahood is luminous by nature, and it is covered up by adventitious defilements. And Buddha nature is said to be permanent, stable, and eternal, and attains through the wisdom of the non-conceptual discernment of the dharmas. And then Zhang Tun concludes, it being established that Buddha nature is what must be attained, there is a difference between what must be abandoned and what attained. Therefore, it is impossible that the ground consciousness and Buddha nature are the same. Yeah, to sum up this point, for Zhang Tun, one abandons the ground consciousness in order to discover what has always been there, Buddha nature, which is identical in Zhang Tun's eyes with the ultimate, the unchangeable perfect nature and Buddhahood. This translates into a three-nature model in which only the unchangeable perfect is accepted as the basis of negation, and the negandum being everything else, imagined, dependent, and unmistaken. In standard Yogacara, the basis of negation is the dependent nature, however. Moreover, Buddhahood is a result of a fundamental transformation upon which the dependent nature ceases to exist as false imagining. And that then is the abandonment of the ground consciousness. The dependent nature thus is not completely abandoned, but partakes as non-conceptual wisdom in the perfect nature. Yeah. Buddha nature thus is not exactly the same as Buddhahood, a distinction that finds good doctrinal support from the Ratnakotra Vibhaka 127. Yeah, 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm shortening a little bit my presentation now. Well, there is a description of the ground consciousness in the Mana Sangraha as being neutral, I don't have the time to go into detail now. And then Zhang refers to the Ratnakotra Vibhaka 116, which says that Buddha nature is virtuous. So if the two were the same, the neutral would be the same as the virtuous. Then the point number 6 is the ultimate would be the same as the relative. Now here again, Zhang quotes a passage from the Ratnakotra Vibhaka, the Anunatva Apunatva Nirdesha, where it is said that the ultimate is an expression for the Buddha element in sentient beings, and the Buddha element in sentient beings, Shariputra, is an expression for Buddha nature. And Buddha nature, Shariputra, is an expression for the Dhammakaya. And then he quotes Ratnakotra Vibhaka 184 and says, therefore this Dhatu or Buddha nature is the Dhammakaya, the Tathagata, the truth of the Noble One's ultimate nirvana. And then Zhang concludes, Buddha nature thus is established as ultimate truth, and as for the ground consciousness, since it is the root concept, false imagining, the dependent, and one of the 8 consciousnesses, it is established as relative truth and cannot be identical with Buddha nature. You have to also keep in mind that for the Chonang Pass, the relative and the absolute truth are not one in essence and different isolates, but they prefer the formula. They are like not the same. The difference is negated in the sense that difference is negated. Identity is negated. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So now we go to the next one, which is the objection that luminosity and obscuration would be the same. Well, he quotes a few verses which support that Buddha nature is luminosity, and then he argues again that the ground consciousness is just the basis of false concepts and of the cause or involved in a causal process of all defilements, and thus is obscuration, and that would be then the same. Yeah. So, well, one could argue that, the natural luminosity of mind can be also taken in terms of the momentary luminosity of the pramana system, namely the ordinary ability of every moment, of every mental event, to be aware of itself. Yeah? And so that would be just normal self-awareness or ability of every mental event to be aware of itself, and that could be also called luminosity. The seventh Kamapa refers to a verse from the Pramana Vatika where this equation is made. And so if you take this kind of luminosity of the Pramana system as Buddha nature, as a potential, so to say, which leads to Buddhahood, then this distinction does not hold water anymore. Zhang distinction, that is. Yeah. Now, that's maybe where I should continue. Zhang then concludes in many minor sutras and pure treatises, Buddha nature has been taught as Dhammakaya, Svabhavikakaya, suchness, extreme limit of reality, signlessness, Dhammatatu, and so on. These attributes are not in the ground consciousness. Since the ground consciousness is impermanent, not stable, etc., they cannot be the same. Yeah. And then Zhang continues and says, if Buddha nature and the ground consciousness were the same, there would be an immeasurable, huge mistake. Therefore, it must be understood that these unique teachings or these rare teachings, one has to say maybe unique has a double connotation, which is not correct here. These rare teachings in the Lankavatara Sutra and the Gandavyuha are intentional because the other scriptures are more numerous and stronger. That's also quite interesting, I've never come across such an argument in hermeneutics. So it's just because there are more other, just by argument of quantity, not quality. Well, I mean, conclusion, even though Zhang Sunam adduces numerous canonical sources and arguments for a clear-cut distinction between Buddha nature and the ground consciousness, the opposing position finds canonical support too. And as for Asanga, the numerous Yogacara influences in the Ratnakotra Vibhaga Vyakya could be easily cited to identify him as a follower of Yogacara, one who interprets the Tathagatagarbha Sutras in line with Yogacara. So you could say also that this is his like a definitive meaning. This is his final intent. Yeah? And this is, for example, very nicely elaborated in Gyalotsawa Shenupel's Ratnakotra Vibhaga commentary, in which Buddha nature is merely taken as a beginningless but still momentary natural flow of mind's luminosity. Well, I hope I didn't over... Yeah, it's okay. I'm concluding here. Thank you very much.
So, yeah. Klaus, thank you so much. This is very interesting. My question is about, you make the distinction clear-cut, as you say, between the Alaya Vijnana, the Kunji Namshe, and Tathagatagarbha and Zhang writings. My question is, because I didn't see in here any mention of the Kunji Yeshi. Does he discuss, as Prabhupada does, Kunji Yeshi and elaborate on that? Although it's not part of the Yogacara model, clearly part of Prabhupada's model.
Well, for some reason he didn't use the concept or the term of Kunji Yeshi.
That's my question.
Yeah, so...
Which is very interesting in and of itself.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. Yeah. Well, I also in the commentaries themselves, not only in the like introduction and the analysis of this relation between Alaya Vijnana and Buddha nature, he does not use the term, but I haven't found it at all in his writings.
Huh.
So he's not using it for some reason.
We
still have to find out why. Yeah. Well, it's a controversial like term, Kunji. Yeah. But you have the distinction already between Kunji Namshe and Kunji. The third Karmapa makes this distinction. He says, well, if you really want to say ground consciousness, you have to say Kunji Namshe. Because if you say only Kunji, it refers to suchness or tatata.
Right.
And he refers to the Gandavyuha Sutra, which indeed has a...
So does Zhang make reference to that?
No, he does not.
He
does not, yeah. But maybe it doesn't mean so much, it's simply that he didn't find the opportunity to use his terminology. Yeah.
If no one else has a question, I'll ask another one. About these 8 problems of the identity of relationship between Buddha nature and alive Vijnana. Does he reference the Samdhina-Mochana Sutra about these 8 problems of the two truths being the same and different? Because a lot of them reflect the same consequences. Does he mention that, or did you see some overlap there?
Yeah, he does not refer to the Samdhina-Mochana Sutra, but of course, the problem is addressed there. And well, I know that at some point Dolpapa raises the possible objection that the Samdhina-Mochana Sutra is not only establishing a difference between the I think it's called the sanskara or the conditioned and the dhatu or something. I don't remember now anymore what terms are used in the Samdhina-Mochana Sutra. Dorje, do you remember? There are 4 arguments for them being the same and 4 arguments for them being different. I think it's dhatu and the sanskaras or something. It's in one chapter of the Samdhina-Mochana. I don't, anyway, it basically comes to this discussion, there are synonyms of what is being discussed here. And so they are he says, well, you always take this sutra for them being separate, but the sutra says also they are neither separate nor identical. Yeah. So like how do you explain so the other negation, that difference is also negated? And Dolpopa replies, well, for a true difference, you need two things, but only the ultimate exists and the relative does not exist at all. So that's why a difference doesn't make sense. So, but like this is a kind of development from the original Yogacara thought, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. I was wondering what Shentong does with this verse, or the line 127c. How does he understand that line when it talks about the fruit being metaphorically applied to Buddha nature? Does he accept that that provides a basis for distinguishing Buddha nature from Buddha?
Yeah, what he does is that it only appears to be a development for an unenlightened mind, which is still under the influence of ignorance and defilements. It seems to develop. There seems to be only a potential which develops and grows into Buddhahood, but in reality it's just the ultimate unchanging, which continues to be disclosed in bigger degrees. So it only appears to grow. And that's what Zhang does. And in the works of, in the Gülama commentary by Sabsamma Dipenchen, another disciple of Dolpopa, you find the explanation that the name for metaphor, upachara, can also mean, a manner of speech. So it doesn't really mean that it is metaphorical usage here, but it's just in a manner of speech, you call it Buddha nature. So it is the same thing, but when it is still wrapped up with adventitious defilements, you just call it in a manner of speech, Buddha nature.
Well,
so that's how they deal with it.
What the Karmapa does with it, which supports, I think, Shantong's view, is that he says he takes the line at face value to mean that it's the idea that being a pala, like a result, that is metaphoric.
Yeah.
Because you can't understand. Then he goes into a long thing about how people are so accustomed to thinking that there is a cause and result that in a kind of provisional way, Buddha nature is referred to as a fruit or.
Yeah, I was also quite puzzled, by that at some point, every now and then the Eighth Karmapa takes up a few arguments from the Chonangpas, and even though, in final analysis, you are just publishing a huge monograph on Eighth Karmapa, so he says that the two truths are like Sungchuk, yeah. And so that's somehow opposed, to what we find here. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have time for one more question? Short one? Professor, I have maybe a short question. Just what do you feel? Do you feel that this argument here of kind of distinguishing between Buddha nature and Kunshi, there's also an implicit argument of trying to define Buddha nature as well? Is that a major intention of the text, do you feel?
Yes, I mean, this analysis is an introduction to the Tathagatagarbha Sutra and the Ratnakodra Vibhaga, like two texts which describe or define Buddha nature. So, it's quite important to have an initial analysis of this relationship in order to read, because the texts themselves can be read in different ways. Yeah, it's like in the Tathagatagarbha Sutra, you find two examples which suggest a natural growth. The example of the chakravarting in the womb of the mother and the seed in the plant. You could argue that there is a natural growth, a development. And also in the Ratnakodra Vibhaga, because of this third reason in 127, you could also argue like that. And these arguments were put forth already at the time of Zhang. So it is quite important, to to have this analysis in the beginning to get the definition of Buddha nature right, or to understand these texts in his way. Yeah? And I think it's a means, not that he doesn't need to repeat that all the time while he is commenting on these texts. So like after I read the commentaries themselves, I was a bit disappointed because I didn't find any extra material. So the commentaries themselves are pretty much standard and could be accepted by just like members of other religious denominations. But like he just gives in the introduction, this analysis for you to understand it or interpret the verses in a proper way. Yeah, okay.